my name is Rossie Hutchinson, and I'm going to talk to you today about combining pre-cuts, such as this jelly roll, fat quarter pack, or charm squares, with your scraps in order to make a quilt that doesn't necessarily look scrappy. Often we might only have the money to buy a smaller pack of fabric. We might come across something sort of after it's out of print. We can only get that little bit. In this case of this quilt, I had in advance a charm pack of fabric that I was just in love with, wanted to play with right away, but didn't want to make a scrappy quilt. I wanted to make a quilt that would really sing. So I'm going to talk about how I think about fabric, and that informs how I choose which scraps to pair with my fabric that I'm choosing. So today what we'll look at is this holiday fabric line. I simply adore this line when it came out, particularly these bears. And so I bought just a fat quarter pack with the intention of making a big lap-size quilt, actually for my husband. He's a huge Christmas fan. So one thing to do when you first get your fabric is spread it out and really look at it and explore it. You don't need to use, even though you're working with such a limited amount of fabric, you don't need to use everything that the designer has included. So in this case, there were just a few prints I liked a little bit less, just in terms of what I'm going to use for this quilt. And so I set those to the side as I'm not going to be matching scraps to those. I doubt that I'm going to use those in this quilt. It's worth remembering, this is all working within your working space, within your stash, within your studio. Any decision that you make like that is provisional. So I actually set this fabric aside and it ended up in the quilt because I needed it to play a certain role at a certain point. But I'm not focusing on it as I'm choosing the rest of my fabric to go in my quilt. Now at this point, I don't yet know what quilt block I'm going to be using. I need to figure out what fabric I have to work from. So looking at these, I see there's a lot of navy blue. There's a little bit of this lovely aqua, one of my favorite colors. There's reds and peaches, and this white, I hope it comes across on camera, is a little bit of an ecru. So it's not really off-white, it's not really bright white, it's ecru, so it's pretty interesting. There is bright white here. So just look at those elements, the color elements. One thing that can help you find the colors in your quilt is often the selvages are printed with something that shows you exactly what the colors are in the different prints. That can help pull that out for you if you're having a hard time seeing it. Now, I'm also looking at sort of what's the design style here. So this is kind of cute. It's holiday-ish. A lot of these just kind of look hand-drawn. These ones here have kind of a graphical, like a retro, graphic, cool element. So I'm going to think about all those things and seek those things within my stash as I go. So what I like to do is in my studio, I actually use this white canvas when I'm pairing these fabrics up. And the reason is there's a lot of, like my cutting mat, my ironing surface, other surfaces that I have in my studio have their own color. And I want to be able to see this as clearly as possible. So I arrange them like this on my white fabric. And then another thing that I might do is, okay, the navy's here, but maybe I don't like the navy as much as these other colors. I might squinch them up. I really love this aqua. I'm going to pull that out just to get more of a sense of what's happening. Then I'm going to pull from my scraps. So I have several laundry baskets worth of scraps. I've pulled a sub-sample for you guys just to talk through what I'm doing. And so we're going to look through the scraps and think about whether they could be joined with these to make a quilt that looks like, hey, maybe these all came from the same fabric line. Who's to say? So here we have a piece of fabric. It's cute. It's got a good design. The colors are going well, but the actual pictures on it are not very holiday. So this is like outside cats, mice, very cheerful, but probably won't work. So we'll set that aside. This has a completely different type of look as well. So we're setting that aside. Now here we have gray. We don't really have gray in this quilt, so no thank you. White, so this might be useful. Something like this, they call them low volume prints, where it's mostly white, off-white with a little bit of color, can often be put in a quilt. So I'm going to save that as a maybe. Same here and here. And this one, not sure. So I set that aside as a maybe. So now we start to get into some more interesting ones. Notice this background is way more yellow than that, but it's got this fun tape motif that might play off the colors. And here we have our first aqua scrap, which is not quite the same color here. But I'm gonna put it into my pile for using with, because when it's separated by other fabrics, it actually, you can't tell that it's not close to the same color or the same color. So keep going through, just comparing. You may find it useful to sort of pile the colors next to what they are, might play the same role as. And here we have one that, oh my goodness, don't we wish this wasn't butterflies. Butterflies isn't very Christmassy, at least here in the United States, because we have Christmas in winter. So that's going to be set aside. Another thing to note about this piece of fabric is that with this line, the dark neutral that you see throughout is navy blue. And that's something to pay attention to. So notice here we have green, which we might think of as a traditional Christmas quilt. There's not a ton of it in this quilt, but I happen to have a lot of it. So maybe I should make a little green stack in case I decide to add in a color. This is one that looks like it could work. So once you have a sense of what your fabrics are that you're going to be using in your quilt, then you need to move on to deciding what quilt block you would like to build from. For me, a huge motivator in buying this fabric was these bears. I love them. So I want to make sure that I'm making a quilt block where I'm not cutting those bears up too much. I want to be able to show off some real bears. So I want something with some big pieces in it. For this, I really find I have an assortment of quilt block books, and just flipping through, looking at what it is. So in this case, I'm using this block here, which they call 12 triangles. You'll see it as square and square, or economy block, traditional quilt block. And then I choose what size of block I want it and write that out for myself. So once I've done that and decided, now I need to make sure that I have the right sizes of these different blocks. So I have drawn my quilt block. I've marked what the size that I need to cut the scraps at are, and I've started to think about where the different color ones will go. So in this quilt, I wanted to put those bears front and center. So you'll see that this center block is a little bit different with how the bears are going. And the bears are above and below, and they're in each of the corners. So that was what happened first, and it meant that I knew that I was doing dark right at the center and at the outside of those quilts, but I didn't have enough dark scraps to continue that throughout. So one thing you can think about is the overall composition of your quilt. Are you going to change where the values are within there? So here we have there with the light on the outside of the block instead of the dark. And I'm using white in addition to that ecru in order to have enough fabric, just because I didn't have a ton of that ecru-based fabric. So I was able to go through, and this quilt, I ended up pulling only a few things from my actual stash, actual yardage, in order to complete it. Mostly able to use up scraps, which is always a goal, and also have a quilt that looks like, I bought a lot more of a set and could enjoy these fabrics. So hopefully these tips on choosing scraps, pairing them with your pre-cuts will help you in your work. Thank you.